So this slide presentation will be about the story of my quilt Crocodylus Smylus, a 22-foot quilt of a 20-foot saltwater crocodile, native to Australia and the South Pacific. For me, my quilts start with a story, an idea, a reason to put the time into a project. After that, when it comes right down to it, it's about the fabric. The idea for this quilt would not have occurred to me had it not been for our son Sam. Well before his safari-themed 4th birthday party, about just about 20 years ago now, he was in love with all things nature, with special emphasis on dinosaurs and crocodiles. He watched anything by crocodile hunter, the late Steve Irwin, a conservationist of Australia best known for rescuing, relocating, and sometimes wrestling the fierce saltwater crocodiles, otherwise known as salties. What I learned from both Steve and the Nature Encyclopedia that Sam chose for me to read to him at bedtime was about that these crocs grow to be an average of 20 feet in length, the Earth's largest living reptile. So I took a tape measure, and with Sam's help, we measured about 20 feet. Wow, that is a large animal. At that time, my entire child could have fit into its mouth alone. And that's when the idea for a quilt came. Saying something is 20 feet is not the same as seeing 20 feet. Flash forward 12 years, picking up crocodile fabric here and there with the idea in a slow simmer. By then, it's August 2013, I had a new studio and a pinning wall that could be adapted for a 20-foot creature. I thought, though, I'd start with the 4-foot head, which would conveniently fit on my more comfortable drawing table. I pulled some Australian Aboriginal-inspired fabric prints and started cutting and pinning, and fell flat on my face. I managed to get an eye, but even that didn't seem right for this quilt. This was worrisome, since I've always been able to push through the messy, scary stage. Instead, by mid-September, I folded it all up and began another quilt. But after a few months, I was ready to try again. And for fresh inspiration, I turned to the significant accumulation of crocodile fabric, 12 years, and counting of gathering material. It was plainly evident that the fabrics I had intuitively picked up for my croc went well beyond the self-imposed limits of Australian Aboriginal prints I had tried to fit attempt number 1 into. Yes, those fabrics still needed to be part of her story, because by now this crocodile was my girl, nicknamed Stevie in honor of Steve Irwin, and she also needed an earthy texture of scaly pattern and leaves and flowers, and I saw her in yellows, oranges, and greens with splashes of reds and aquas, and I was re-inspired. After getting back in touch with my fabrics, I needed a clean slate for my croc. I took to heart the thought that you need to see 20 feet in order to appreciate it. So I needed to see what Stevie's 20-foot length would look like. And in the upper left photo, the side-to-side dimension of the flannel foundation you fabric see there is 20 feet. So that was my inspiration. So I was either going to be inspired by the size or scared by it. But, you know, I got to get started somewhere. And around that same time, we took a trip to Boston to the Harvard's Natural History Museum. And I happened to see a stuffed saltwater croc there. And I got some photos plus some skulls that you'll see later. And that was, you know, exactly what I needed for some inspiration. Now, this youngster didn't have the bulk I wanted for my girl, but it still gave me some ideas. And since I couldn't find any photos of a walking saltwater croc, which was what I wanted to do, the best guide I could find was a little black silhouette from an Aussie newspaper article that was speculating on a missing person. And I added the legs, which were close, but as I found out later, really weren't right. But in any case, it did give me a place to start. And I didn't know about those issues I'd have to face along the way, so I didn't have to be worried about them yet. So I enlarged my beginning small lined drawing sketches onto my big blank foundation fabric with the old-fashioned grid system. The skull that I had photographed at the museum really showed me how amazingly jagged the jaw lines are and how the teeth fit in around the bone structure. And then, as I stared at all that white canvas, I picked her eye to start with. I cut out some fabrics with curves and began her cheek and eyebrow. And through all her changes, that center of her eye stayed as it was, with a little glitter twinkle added at the end. Then Stevie and I were on a roll. This time the messy, scary stage came and went with every part of her, but it all worked out. I used fabric with prints that corresponded to her contours, flowing leaves for the curve of her cheek, linear texture for the length of her snout, and big batik circles for the puffy curves of skin at the corner of her mouth. It was, of course, very satisfying to see her emerge from the pinning wall. But she did stall for a few more months. Maybe it was the immensity of the project, but she hung out waiting for me. What I needed was a kick in the pants. And I got that mid-February 2015, about a year after I put down those first pieces. That February, I got a call from the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts. They wondered if they could borrow my pink rhino quilt for an upcoming show of animal-inspired quilts. With Tom's prodding, he was getting tired of seeing a swayback Stevie on the wall, I said sure to the rhino, and by the way, would you have room for a, let's say, 22-foot or so crocodile quilt? To my amazement, they gave a definite yes to a very incomplete creature, and I had an 8-month deadline. I got back to work by pinning up full folds of fabric to fill in her outline, a quick fix of pattern and color inspiration. The time for debate was over. I had to see how her color would progress from one end to another. I found I liked reds and aquas as the sparks to her yellows and greens. I wanted her grounded in reality, but fantastical in personality. I work in drafts. First draft is get something down. That would be the top left photo. Below left photo is the second draft. Now, I am going to try something here. I haven't done this on other ones. Can you see my little cursor moving around? Of course, you probably can't tell me if you see it, but anyway, I've got a cursor moving around here because I want you to just look here. See this very center? It's kind of like a lighter circle with a dark spot. You can find it down here in the lower one, just for comparison. So even though the two photos look a bit different, it is the same one. First draft, first layer of stuff, and then the second layer. And in that second layer, reds and other dark splotches were added for the dark spots found on a saltwater crocodile's belly. I wanted her skin to be gnarly, maybe battle-worn or survivor with character and boldness. The photos on the right show areas I cut from one fabric to add pops of color and visual texture in the shadow of her back leg. And then Tom came in to check on our progress and remarked, I hate to say this, but I don't think her back hip is right. And I wasn't happy to admit it, but he was right. We figured out she had kind of like lizard hips as opposed to crocodile hips. My lack of a good photo to work from was coming back to bite me. Turns out not only her hips, but the back leg and underside were problems as well. So I pulled off those collaged areas in glued together chunks, redrew and reassembled. I was learning a lot about crocodile anatomy with my intermittent research. The lower photo shows her proper proportions and bone structure so far. Stevie appreciated her new power thighs. Now she was coming along, tip of nose to tip of tail. But wait, tails can't stick out like that, can they? There's some weight to them, right? Wouldn't they drag on the ground? Well, yes it does, making it abundantly clear that I've never lived anywhere near crocodiles. Back to the drawing board, as they say. This was a fairly painless fix, as those tail fabrics were only pinned in place. In photos left to right, top to bottom, I sketched a new underside of tail line and lowered the fabric pieces to match. That's in the upper right. Then I did the same for the top of her tail, in the lower left, and in the lower right, reassembled, easy peasy. To finish her tail, I added fabrics with either linear patterns or cut with straight edges to suggest the vertical sections I saw in that museum specimen. That's the bow to realism. The circles cut from Australian fabrics are fun bubbles or warts, or just there because I like them. I also felt that having some of them disappear behind the straight cut pieces emphasized the linear look of the underside. And on the top ridge of her tail, I had noticed in photos that The divided lines of plates got slightly larger as they neared the tip of her tail. And here's where I took some artistic liberty and gave Stevie a badass flaming red tail. She was going to eventually need something to balance out her still to come toothy grin anyway. The second draft is all about fixing up. And that's fixing up what you've already put down, except her front leg was the next part for me to realize it was not quite correct, so off it came. The practical beauty of a collage. In the upper left photo, you can kind of see the first and second drawings of her front leg. The pieces of fabric hanging to the left and underneath there are what I had just taken off. The top right photo is the numerous redraws beginning to resemble a sketch of Marcel Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. Something to look up if you're not familiar with the painting. The blue marker line is my final decision. In figuring all that out, I still couldn't find photos of a walking saltwater croc, but my research did find a scientific paper of the locomotion of crocodiles. So paper in hand, I got down on my studio floor to use myself as a model as I read how crocs walk. An extreme measure, yes, but it solved the front leg problem. To celebrate, Stevie got red toenails to match her tail. And then it was finally time for Stevie's teeth. I had put them off since I hadn't come across the right fabric yet. And I wanted to give myself the time to find this very important part of a crocodile. And I always prefer to let the fabric do at least some of the work for me. And then just in time, there it was, buried deep, probably 20 years or more in my stash. Stevie's teeth needed to be worn and striated with use and age. A pretty ivory would not do, but this smoggy, stormy cloud print had exactly what I was looking for. Dark bits of fabric tucked behind her new old teeth for contrast completed her smile. Stevie the crocodile's first and second drafts are now done. Amid all her many, many fabrics are some with animal images. Australian animals, since as an uber predator, she'd probably have some of these inside herself in real life as well. So let's see. I'm going to show you some of these things in a demo, but right here you've got, there's a snake. Can you see that arrow up there? Can you see it, Tom? Yeah, okay. And then if you fall, oh, but it's really, really small, he says. So tell you what, there is snake, there's emus, let's see, there's, oh yeah, kangaroos, a lizard, and I will show all of those to you in the demo because my assistant says it is not worth showing that to you now. But here's Ginny, my girl, my studio assistant, Ginny Cat, and is modeling some of the sheer fabrics I considered for Stevie's third draft, the final additions to the collage. I collect all sorts of sheer and translucent fabrics. Many have printed designs on them, a pink floral in the top photo you can see, and one of the many printed camouflage sheers that were strangely popular around that time. These could all add additional modeling to Stevie's skin, and the metallic mesh would add highlights. Dark sheers help add depth to recessed areas, such as the tooth dents on her muzzle. The lighter colored metallic sheers add highlights to the outturned curves of her jawline, accenting the ins and outs of her skull. Her teeth got some glittered tulle to accent and moisten them up. Printed organza overlay on the muzzle helped blend from one transition to another. And glittered purple dots added on another type of sheer gave a highlight to the top of her head. And I think you can see a little bit of that. Some opaque white sheer lightens up her underside, and that continued in pieces all the way down to her tail. And please remind me if I forget in the demo, but she does have a purple beauty mark. The details on the top show 3 different sheers. There's a printed organza, a variegated lace, and an orange sparkle tulle. In the top left, they're kind of pulled aside, and in the top right, they're laid down. And in doing something like that, putting them over the original collaged fabrics, it softens the look of the fabrics underneath. It blends them. It also adds texture. And in the body close-up below, you can start to see how those shears are adding to the value range of the image, from the shadowed areas to the highlights and some colorful sparkle in between. Sheer fabrics also help to subdue areas that could be otherwise distracting. I loved using the large pattern Australian print of this fabric with the kangaroos and the Aboriginal symbols, but as it was, it kept catching my eye. Layers of a blue and black camouflage netting shaded and muddled parts of the design enough to allow that part of the tail to visually curve behind her leg. Though I did leave one of the bullseye spots in most of the kangaroos as they were. I don't want to disguise everything. In the concentrated hours I was putting into this project, sometimes I'd amuse myself by looking at her from one end or the other just to see how the perspective changed one's perception of her length. One time I questioned if maybe I had overemphasized her tail. But she was all right. With the shears added, I considered the third draft done and ready for a background. Her messy stage was over, but my studio took months to recover. Instead of using up the collected fabrics, I think they multiplied in those piles. But before I could add background fabrics, I had to add to the foundation fabric, which meant that Tom had to add to my pinning wall. Not that I needed that door anyway, and a couple windows on either side. The pinning boards are 4x8 sheets of 2-inch insulation foam purchased from a hardware store. Now I could start pulling a few choice fabrics saved for something special. They were the first ones auditioned on the wall for the background. This sort of straight-edged collage of larger pieces of fabrics was working well for me. It allowed some of those beautiful cuts of fabric to shine just as they were. Shibori dyed pieces given to me by a Canadian friend were especially fun to work in, and hand-dyed and over-dyed pieces from other friends found choice spots as well. Another couple shots playing with perspective. I've talked about the decision to overlay tulle or not as a final addition overtop the entire top of a collage quilt. I was able to snag a length of subtly patterned camouflage tulle, different yet from the others I'd used. I was holding it up one day to see what I thought. It would certainly cut down my final gluing by days. When once again Tom walked into my studio. Let's just say he's not fond of tulle as a top layer. It does alter the finished look, but I thought this camo tulle had a possibility. So we reached a compromise. He'd do most of the final croc gluing while I finished the background and not use the tulle. A few days later, both were done. The final background, lower right, ended up reflecting the basic story of where a saltwater crocodile lives, an estuary environment of both fresh and salt water. My Stevie girl is emerging from undergrowth, crossing the sand, and walking past reeds into the water. Since I couldn't fit the red and orange squares into that story, they got dropped. And I think that worked for the better as well. Now, I know last week I got a question about long arm quilting, and try as I might, I couldn't figure out how to get that crocodile quilt under my little home Bernina. So it was the first time that I ever long arm quilted. A first time for everything, right? And it was totally appropriate for this quilt. So she got rolled up. Amazing how something that big can roll into something so small. I rented time and tutoring from a wonderful lady at a nearby quilt store. And I was off. 4 days later, I was done. So here now, we decided that I would start at the tail end because I kind of figured that, you know, people were looking at her all done. That face was where they were going to concentrate their viewing. So I could start learning how to do this around the tail, and better yet, in that upper right-hand corner where, you know, all the attention would not be. So here we go, start and finish. And it turned out, you know, it turned out okay. It was an experience and another part of Stevie's story. Once I got her home, the only place I had to, as a work surface, was the floor. So all the furniture got pushed to the side, and Ginny was quite happy to have a new rug for a few days. And it's not ideal. I would not recommend it to anyone, but like I said, it was the only place I had to work. And so I had to square her up on the floor. Tom helped me with chalk line. We used a chalk line to help square her up, and trimmed her down, got binding on. And then to finish it up, who are you going to call when you need some help? Your mama. So here's my mama, and she lives next door to us. Both my folks do. And she's always asking if she can help me with something, and she loves hand sewing. So I needed the help. There was over 100 feet of the faced binding to hand sew onto the back, plus the casing. And then she was finished, just in time to pack her up in a shipping tube that Tom fashioned for her and send her off to Wisconsin. Here are a few detail shots. Shows some of the quilting. Now, for me, and I've talked about this before as well, quilting adds a general texture to the quilt. I don't do much detail work with it. And for Stevie, I ended up quilting her in 2 different varieties of a variegated thread. Most everything was kind of a multicolored, and then around her face there, where it was really light, and right above her head, where it was also light fabric, it was just a variegated yellow that I used. And then for the end of the beginning of Stevie's story, she got it to the Wisconsin Museum of Quilts and Fiber Arts, got into a really nice show there. She made some hanging memories for the team of volunteers that were setting her up. And a few weeks later, I got to go see the show myself. It was over 150 different animal-inspired works in fiber, and from over 100 different artists. And it was just a really wonderful show. Stevie has been in other shows since then. But this one was the first, and it was the final push that I needed to bring her into being.